The dust had not yet settled on the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, when Clara Sawyer arrived on the afternoon stage in the spring of 1878, and every man within eyeshot stopped what he was doing to stare. She was not the kind of woman who demanded attention through vanity or pretense. She demanded it simply by existing. By the way she stepped down from the coach with one hand gripping the iron rail and the other pressing her traveling hat against the prairie wind, her brown eyes scanning the street with the calm, measured look of someone who had already decided she would not be impressed easily. She wore a practical dress of deep green calico, dusty from 3 days on the road, and her dark hair was pinned beneath her hat in loose, determined waves that refused to stay put. She was 24 years old, the only daughter of a man who had recently died and left her nothing but a deed to a parcel of land 40 miles west of town, and a letter explaining that she had an uncle named Thomas Sawyer who would help her get settled. The problem was that Thomas Sawyer had passed away 2 months prior, a fact that nobody had bothered to write to Clara about in time. She stood in front of the Wells Fargo office with her single trunk and her leather satchel, the stage pulling away in a cloud of grit behind her, and she read the notice that had been pinned to a post by the land office, a brief, impersonal announcement of Thomas Sawyer's passing and the temporary administration of his small cattle operation, and she simply stood there for a long moment, absorbing the reality of the situation with the kind of quiet that preceded either tears or action. Clara chose action. She picked up her satchel and walked directly across the street to the Caldwell Hotel, booked herself the cheapest available room, and then went to find whoever was managing her uncle's land until his affairs could be sorted. That was how she first heard the name John Prescott. The woman behind the hotel desk, a stout and kind-faced woman named Mrs. Ellie Hatch, told her that John Prescott had been the one to find Thomas Sawyer when he fell, had been the one to ride for the doctor, and had been helping to keep the small operation running since the old man's passing. He was a cowboy and a good one, Mrs. Hatch said, without the sort of meanness that too many men in this territory carried around like a badge. He worked the range south of town and had known Thomas Sawyer for nearly a decade. Clara thanked Mrs. Hatch and asked where she might find this John Prescott. Mrs. Hatch told her he would likely be at the Red Lantern Saloon come supper time, not because he was a drinking man particularly, but because that was where most of the working hands gathered to eat and hear what work was available. He was usually easy to spot, she said, because he was quieter than the rest. Clara was not in the habit of walking into saloons. She had been raised in Missouri in a household that considered it a moral failing, but she was also in the habit of solving her own problems, and there was no one in Caldwell, Kansas, who was going to solve them for her. So at 6:30, with the sun beginning to lower its heavy orange weight toward the horizon, she pushed open the doors of the Red Lantern and walked inside. The saloon was loud and warm and smelled of sawdust and tobacco, and the particular kind of sweat that belonged to men who worked hard outdoors. Several heads turned. A few conversations paused. The piano player in the corner did not stop playing, and for that Clara was quietly grateful because at least there was still noise covering the silence of people staring at her. She went to the bar and asked the barkeep, a lean man with impressive mutton-chop whiskers, if he could point her toward John Prescott. The barkeep looked at her with mild surprise, then nodded toward the far end of the room without a word. John Prescott was sitting alone at a corner table with a plate of beans and cornbread and a cup of coffee, reading a folded newspaper by the amber light of the oil lamp on the wall. He was tall, even sitting down broad through the shoulders in the way that came not from show but from years of real work, with hands that were large and weathered resting on either side of his plate. He had dark hair that needed a trim and a jaw shadowed with several days of stubble, and his hat was hung on the back of his chair. He was, Clara guessed, somewhere around 30 years old, and he was not what she had expected, though she could not have said precisely what she had expected. He had a calm about him that she noticed immediately, the kind of stillness that was not laziness but rather the natural resting state of a man who had learned long ago that most things were not worth getting agitated over. He looked up when she approached, and his eyes, a steady, dark shade of gray, met hers with neither excessive interest nor the deliberate coldness that some men used to make women feel unwelcome. "Mr. Prescott," she said, and her voice came out even and composed, which she was privately proud of because her heart was hammering. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and he stood immediately, because whatever else could be said about John Prescott, his mother had raised him correctly. "My name is Clara Sawyer. Thomas Sawyer was my uncle. I've just arrived on the afternoon stage, and I understand you've been overseeing what remains of his operation." Something shifted in his expression then, not quite surprise, but a deepening of attention as though he were recalibrating something. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Please sit down, Miss Sawyer. I'm sorry about your uncle. He was a good man." "I've been told as much," she said, sitting. "I'm sorry I didn't know him well. I only met him twice in my life. My father and he had a falling out years ago." She paused. "I received the deed to his land in my father's estate, and so here I am." John Prescott sat back down slowly and looked at her with that steady gray gaze. "You've come to work the land yourself." "I've come to assess what I have," she said, "and to determine what's possible." There was a beat of silence between them. The piano played on. Someone laughed loudly on the other side of the room. "It's a modest operation," John said. "About 60 head of cattle, a small house that needs some repairs, a barn, a well. The land itself is good, though it's been let go a bit these past months. Your uncle managed it alone the last few years. He had one hired hand who moved on after the old man passed." Clara listened carefully. "And you've been keeping watch over it out of respect for my uncle." John looked at his coffee for a moment before answering. "He was kind to me when I first came to this territory. It seemed the right thing to do." Something about the way he said it, plainly and without any expectation of credit, settled something in Clara's chest. She had met enough men who performed their good deeds loudly, who wanted something in return for every courtesy. This man stated a simple fact and moved on. "I would pay you, of course," she said, "if you were willing to continue helping me until I find my footing. I won't pretend I know anything about cattle or the range. I grew up in Missouri." "My father was a school teacher," John nodded slowly. "I can help you. I've got a contract with the Carson outfit through the end of this month. After that, I'm between arrangements. When could you take me out to see the property?" "Tomorrow, if you'd like. I can ride out with you in the morning, show you the place, let you see what you're working with." Clara looked at this quiet man across the table in a saloon where she had no business being, and she made the first of what would turn out to be several good decisions in Caldwell, Kansas. She trusted him. "Tomorrow morning, then," she said. "I'll be at the livery at 8. She stood, and he stood with her, and when she left the saloon and walked back to the hotel through the warm spring evening, the air smelling of horses and prairie grass, and the faint sweetness of something blooming far out on the plains, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. John Prescott sat back down after she left and looked at his untouched coffee and his half-eaten cornbread, and he did not pick up his newspaper again for a long time. The next morning was clear and cool, that particular clarity that belongs to spring mornings on the Kansas plains, when the sky seems bigger than it does anywhere else on earth. A dome of pale blue pressing down on a world of yellow and green grass, stretching in every direction to the edge of visibility. Clara was at the livery at 10 minutes before 8, dressed in the most practical clothes she owned, a heavier brown skirt, a white blouse, and her good leather boots, her satchel over one shoulder and her hat tied firmly under her chin with a ribbon. John Prescott was already there, his horse a solid, dark brown gelding he called Cinder, saddled and waiting. He had arranged for the liveryman to rent Clara a gentle bay mare named Pepper, and when Clara walked up, he introduced the horse first before he said good morning, which made Clara smile in spite of herself. They rode out of town heading southwest, following a wagon track that curved through the tall grass, and for the first several miles they rode mostly in comfortable silence, which Clara found to be one of his better qualities. She had known men who filled silence with chatter the way some people filled empty space with furniture, compulsively, without consideration for whether it was needed. John Prescott spoke when he had something worth saying and was quiet when he did not. He told her about the land as they rode, about the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property that had good water even in dry summers, about the herd, and how her uncle had bred for size rather than speed, about the house's south-facing porch that caught the morning sun and made the winters more bearable. He spoke about Thomas Sawyer with a fondness that was not sentimental but real, noting small things. That the old man had kept a kitchen garden he was inordinately proud of, that he had read every book he could get his hands on, that he had been the kind of man who remembered everyone's name and used it. Clara listened and watched the land unfold around her, and felt the strange ache of mourning someone she had barely known. When they arrived at the property, she understood immediately why Thomas Sawyer had stayed. The house was small and needed work. The porch railing had come loose on one side, and several roof shingles were missing, but it sat on a low rise with the creek glittering below it and the Kansas sky overhead, and there was something undeniably right about the placement of it, the way it belonged there, the way certain things simply belong in certain places. She walked through every room while John waited on the porch, giving her privacy for this first encounter with the place. The inside was neat, spare, worn with use, books on a shelf above the fireplace, a kitchen that had been kept clean, a bedroom with a quilt on the bed that had been made by someone who loved color. Clara ran her hand over the quilt and thought about a man who had lived alone and read books and grown vegetables, and been kind to a young cowboy finding his way in a new territory, and she thought that was actually a very decent life. She came back out to the porch and stood beside John Prescott and looked out over the land that was now, improbably, hers. "I'm going to stay," she said. It was not a question. It was a conclusion she had already arrived at before the words came out. John looked at her sideways, not with doubt but with assessment. "It'll be hard," he said, "running this place. I know. Do you?" She turned and looked at him directly. "Mr. Prescott, I've been managing my father's household since I was 16. I've kept accounts, negotiated with merchants, and handled a drought that nearly wiped out his garden 3 years running. I am not afraid of hard work. I am afraid of ignorance, and I intend to correct that as quickly as possible." There was a pause, and then something changed in his face, not dramatically, not in any way that the casual observer might have noticed, but Clara was watching and she saw it. A kind of quiet respect settling in. A reassessment. "All right," he said simply. She moved into the house that week. John Prescott helped her carry her trunk in from town and spent 3 days making the most critical repairs: the porch railing, the missing shingles, a window shutter that had come off its hinges and was banging in the wind. He did not make a production of it. He simply showed up in the mornings with tools and went to work. And in the evenings Clara fed him supper, because it was the sensible thing to do when a man was doing work on your property. And they sat on the repaired porch as the sun went down and talked about everything from the price of beef at the railhead, to the geological particulars of the Kansas prairie, to the books Thomas had left on his shelf. She discovered that John Prescott had received only a modest formal education, but had pursued an entirely self-directed one with some dedication. He had read extensively on topics that most cowboys never touched: history, philosophy, a particular fondness for natural science that had led him to learn the names of the grasses and wildflowers of the plains, the way other men learned the names of card games. She discovered that he had come to Kansas from Tennessee at the age of 19, 10 years ago now, and had been working cattle ever since, never settling with any one outfit for longer than a season or two, never putting down roots in any particular place. She discovered that he had never courted anyone. She found this out on the fourth evening when Mrs. Hatch came out from town with a neighbor woman to pay a social call on Clara and assess her domestic situation, as neighbors did. Mrs. Hatch was delighted to find John on the porch and remarked with great cheerfulness that it was time someone took that man in hand, as he had been wandering the territory for a decade without any thought for his future or any interest in any of the perfectly decent young women of Caldwell who would have been glad of his attention. John received this observation with a patience that suggested he had heard it before, and when Mrs. Hatch and her companion had gone inside with Clara to inspect the house, Clara found herself lingering a moment on the porch, looking at the man who was studying the distant tree line along the creek with the focused calm of someone not particularly interested in discussing his romantic history. She could not quite help herself. Curiosity had always been one of her defining characteristics, occasionally to her detriment. "Is it true," she asked, "that you've never courted anyone?" He glanced at her briefly, then back at the tree line. "Mrs. Hatch takes a broad interest in other people's affairs." That wasn't an answer. A pause. The prairie wind moved through the grass below the rise. A meadowlark sang 3 notes and stopped. "It's true," he said. She watched the side of his face for a moment. "Why?" The question sat between them for a long time. She thought he might not answer at all, and she was already forming her apology for the intrusion when he spoke. "I was waiting on someone specific." She did not know what to do with that. She turned it over in her mind, the plainness of the statement, the utter lack of self-consciousness in it, the way he said it as though it were the most natural thing in the world, as though there were no mystery in it at all. He had been waiting on someone specific. As though the world were the kind of place where a man could simply decide that and have it mean something. She went inside to help Mrs. Hatch with the tea things and did not ask him another question about it that evening. But she thought about it later, lying in the bedroom with the quilt pulled up and the prairie dark and enormous around the small house, the sound of coyotes distant and mournful somewhere to the west. She thought about a man who had been wandering this territory for 10 years and had not courted a single woman, not because he was a monk or a misanthrope, but because he was waiting on someone specific. She thought about what kind of faith that required, what kind of patience, what kind of certainty. She fell asleep still thinking about it, and she dreamed of something she did not remember in the morning, but she woke with a feeling of warmth she could not explain. John completed his contract with the Carson outfit at the end of the month and came back to the Sawyer property with his bedroll and his gear and the quiet assumption that he was now employed there for as long as was needed. Clara had not precisely asked him, and he had not precisely offered. It had simply been agreed upon in the elliptical way that 2 practical-minded people sometimes arrive at decisions without having to announce them. She paid him a fair wage from the small amount of savings her father's estate had yielded, and he accepted without negotiating, which she had not expected but appreciated. May came to the Kansas plains in a rush of color wildflowers in the grass, the creek running high and fast with snowmelt from somewhere to the north, the cattle fat and calm in the lower pasture. Clara learned the work of the place steadily and without complaint, following John through the morning chores, asking questions constantly, absorbing the answers and filing them away. She was not naturally suited to physical labor in the way that someone raised to it would be, but she was organized and methodical and willing, and within 3 weeks she could handle the morning feeding and check the fence line on the creek side without assistance. John watched her adapt with a quiet attention she sometimes caught out of the corner of her eye. He never hovered. He never condescended. When she did something incorrectly, he explained the right way without commentary on the wrong one, which was more than she could have said for most men she'd encountered. The days settled into a rhythm: mornings of work, evenings on the porch, conversations that ranged wide across every subject and narrow into silence when silence was better. She brought out 2 of Thomas's books one evening and they read side by side on the porch steps, the oil lamp between them, the moths circling, the great Kansas dark pressing comfortably in from all sides. She became aware, with the specific sharpened awareness that a woman develops when she is trying not to be aware of something, that she was thinking about him more than the practical demands of the property required. She noticed when he laughed, a low, genuine sound that he did not deploy carelessly. She noticed that he had a habit of running his thumb along his jaw when he was thinking through a problem. She noticed that when she was cold in the evenings, which happened as May turned temperamental and the nights swung unexpectedly back toward winter, he would set a word down in the middle of a sentence and go inside to bring her a blanket without her having said anything, without any remark about it when he came back. She was not naive. She had been admired before. She had even been offered courtship twice by men in Missouri who were decent enough but had left her with the feeling of being evaluated rather than seen. This was different. This was a man who paid attention to her the way he paid attention to the weather and the grass and the condition of the cattle, not with the intent to catalog her, but with genuine interest in what was actually there. She tried very hard not to read too much into any of it. She was not always successful. The trouble with the Dunbar brothers arrived in the middle of May, on a Tuesday afternoon when the wind had come up hard from the south, and the sky was the particular shade of yellow that preceded a storm. Clara was in the kitchen garden, Thomas's kitchen garden, which she had claimed as her own project, when she heard the horses. There were 3 of them, the Dunbar brothers and a hired man called Reb, and they had been, according to local knowledge Clara had been gathering, making a practice of pressuring smaller landowners in the county to sell their properties at below-value prices, using intimidation when financial pressure failed. Thomas Sawyer had refused to sell to them twice. Clara's arrival had, apparently, presented what they considered an opportunity. The man who spoke first was the eldest Dunbar, Wade, a big man with a thick red beard and the kind of smile that was meant to suggest friendliness, but contained no warmth whatsoever. He told Clara that her uncle's operation was modest and clearly in need of help, that running land alone was difficult for a woman, that he and his brothers would be glad to take the property off her hands at a fair price, so she could return to wherever she had come from without any further inconvenience. Clara looked at Wade Dunbar from the kitchen garden with dirt on her gloves and a trowel in her hand, and a spine made of something considerably stronger than convention gave her credit for. "I am not interested in selling," she said clearly. "I've only just arrived, and this land belonged to my family, and I intend to keep it." Wade Dunbar's smile did not change, but his eyes did. He was beginning to say something further, something that Clara instinctively knew would cross from persuasion into threat, when the barn door opened and John Prescott came out. He had been hearing the horses for several minutes. He walked across the yard at a deliberate pace, not rushing, and came to stand on Clara's side of the conversation, near enough that his presence was unmistakable but not aggressively positioned. He greeted Wade Dunbar by name. Wade Dunbar greeted him in return with a careful, recalibrated politeness. "Miss Sawyer has given you her answer," John said, and his voice was the same even, unhurried tone he used for everything, which somehow made it more authoritative than if he had raised it. "I expect that's the end of the conversation." Wade Dunbar looked at John Prescott with the measuring stare of a man reassessing a situation he had expected to be simple. He looked at the way John stood. He looked at the controlled stillness in the other man's face. He made a calculation. "We'll be back," he said, turning his horse. It was the kind of statement that was meant to be menacing. Clara watched them ride away and did not move until they were out of sight. Then she exhaled. "They'll come back," she said. "Probably," John agreed. "What do we do?" He was quiet for a moment. "Talk to the sheriff. Get your deed properly filed and recorded so there's no question of your legal standing. Be visible in town, let people know you're here and intend to stay. The Dunbars operate through isolation. They make more progress when no one's paying attention." Clara nodded. "And you'll stay?" It was not quite a question. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I'll stay." She went to the sheriff the following week. a weathered man named Sheriff Corby, who listened to her account with careful attention and promised to pay a visit to the Dunbar property with a reminder about the legal consequences of harassment. He also quietly suggested that having John Prescott on the property was a deterrent of considerable value, since John had a reputation in the county as a man who was not to be trifled with, not because of any violent history, but because of a fundamental reliability, the sense that if he said he would do something, he would do it. Clara filed her deed at the county seat in the second week of May, riding there on Pepper with John beside her on Cinder, and afterward they ate lunch at a small restaurant near the courthouse, where the woman who served them brought out slices of dried apple pie with the quiet satisfaction of someone who knew it was good and had no need to announce it. Clara ate her pie and felt the strange buoyancy of a problem, if not solved, at least set in order, and she looked at the man across the table and said what she had been thinking since the morning. "I need to thank you, not just for today, for all of it." John looked up from his pie with that particular expression of his that was not quite uncomfortable but adjacent to it, a man who received gratitude the way some people received unexpected weather, not knowing entirely what to do with it. "You don't need to," he said. "I want to. It matters to me that you've been here." He looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes that were always steadier than anything around them. "It matters to me too," he said. And then he went back to his pie, and Clara felt something bloom unexpectedly in her chest, something warm and inconvenient and absolutely impossible to ignore. June arrived, and with it the real work of the cattle operation, branding the calves born that spring, repairing the south fence line where the winter had done damage, preparing for the summer grazing rotation. John taught her the rhythm of it, the logic of moving the herd between sections of pasture to keep the grass from being overgrazed, the way to read the cattle's behavior for signs of illness or distress. He had a natural ease with animals that Clara found beautiful to watch, not the rough handling that some men used, but a patient, communicative approach, reading the horse or the cow as though it were making statements he intended to answer. She worked beside him in the June heat and tied her hair back and rolled up her sleeves and stopped caring entirely about what she might look like, because there was too much to do and the land was too beautiful and the work was too satisfying. She had not known that physical labor done well could feel like that, like a kind of integrity, a matching of effort to outcome that her previous life had rarely offered her. One afternoon in late June, the heat pressing down like a physical weight and the creek shining silver at the bottom of the rise, they were working on the south fence line, and Clara misjudged the tension on a wire, and it snapped back and caught her across the palm of her left hand, not deeply but sharply enough to bleed freely. She made a sound she was not proud of and pressed her palm against her skirt, and John was there before she had processed what had happened. He said nothing, just took her hand in both of his with a careful firmness and examined the cut, and she was suddenly acutely conscious of the size of his hands around hers and the closeness and the fact that she could see the individual lines of concentration in his forehead as he assessed the damage. "It's not deep," he said. "Needs to be cleaned and wrapped." "I know," she said. "I'm fine. You're bleeding considerably. I know that too." He looked up at her then, from the distance of about 12 inches, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the prairie was entirely silent around them, and the only thing in Clara Sawyer's awareness was the gray of his eyes and the warmth of his hands, and the fact that her heart was making a great deal of noise. He looked back down at her hand. "Let's get you back to the house," he said, and his voice was just slightly different than usual, not lower, not rougher, but more careful, somehow, as though he were handling something he was afraid to damage. She let him lead her back up the rise to the house. He cleaned and bandaged the cut with a competence that suggested he had done this sort of thing for himself many times and made no fuss about it. When he tied the last knot in the bandage and she would have pulled her hand away, he held it for just a second longer than he needed to. Just a second. Then he let go and said she should avoid the wire work for a few days, and she said she would, and they both pretended the moment had been nothing beyond a practical one. That evening on the porch, the fireflies beginning their quiet conversation in the grass below the rise, Clara decided she had been careful long enough. "You said something to me some weeks ago," she said, "when I asked why you'd never courted anyone." John was quiet beside her, looking at the fireflies. "You said you were waiting on someone specific." She paused. "I've been thinking about that since you said it, and I can't stop thinking about it, and I'd like to understand what it meant." He was still for a long moment. The fireflies drifted. Something small moved in the grass. "It meant what it said," he told her quietly. "Someone you'd met before, someone you were hoping to find again." He turned and looked at her, and the oil lamp through the window behind her lit the edge of her face with a soft yellow light. And John Prescott looked at Clara Sawyer the way a man looks at something he has wanted for a long time and is not certain he is permitted to want. "No," he said. "I don't know that I could have described them beforehand. It was more of a sense that there was a particular sort of person worth waiting for, and that settling for less to avoid loneliness seemed a bad bargain. So I waited." Clara held his gaze. "And have you stopped waiting?" He exhaled very quietly. "Yes, Miss Sawyer, I believe I have." The name, the formal name, the one he always used with that particular careful respect, felt both like a courtesy and a kind of last distance, and Clara made her second very good decision in Caldwell, Kansas. "You could call me Clara," she said. "I think we've known each other long enough." Something moved in his face that she had not seen there before. Something opened, or was permitted to open. He said her name once, just her name, Clara, as though testing it, and it sounded different in his voice than it had ever sounded in anyone else's, and she was suddenly very certain of something she had been carefully pretending to be uncertain about. She looked away before she said something rash, down at the fireflies in the dark grass, and he let her, and they sat in the particular silence of two people who have arrived somewhere together and are taking a moment to understand where they are before they decide what to do next. The Dunbar brothers came back in early July, and this time it was less like a business conversation and more like a demonstration of capability. They had sent their hired man Reb and two other hands Clara had never seen, and they drove a section of her south fence down in broad daylight, turning their own cattle in through the gap onto her land and claiming afterward that it had been an accident, that the fence had been improperly maintained and had given way of its own accord. John found the damage the following morning and read the tracks and the evidence with the careful attention of someone who had been around enough rough dealing to know what it looked like. He brought Clara out to see it and explained what he believed had happened and why, speaking plainly and without melodrama. Clara listened to all of it with the calm that she had come to recognize in herself as a particular kind of anger, not hot and immediate but cool and determined, the kind that lasted. "I'm not leaving," she said. "I know," he said, and there was a pride in his voice she recognized now, the same pride that had been building quietly in his expression for weeks, not possessive pride, not the pride of ownership, but the pride of genuine admiration. They went to Sheriff Corby again, with John's account of the tracks and the deliberateness of the damage, and this time the sheriff rode out himself and inspected the site and visited the Dunbar property afterward. What was said there, exactly, Clara never fully learned, but the Dunbars did not interfere with the fence again. What they did instead was more insidious. They spread a story in town, in the way that stories spread in small towns, at the dry goods store and the post office and the saloon, from mouth to ear to mouth, that Clara Sawyer was not managing her land herself at all, that John Prescott was the real hand behind the operation, and that it was improper for a single woman to be living out on a property with an unchaperoned man. And what did that say about her character? Clara heard the story in its various forms through Mrs. Hatch, who brought it to her with genuine distress and a platter of corn muffins by way of mitigation. The older woman sat at the kitchen table and explained the situation in careful, worried language, and Clara listened to all of it and then ate one of the corn muffins and thanked Mrs. Hatch for telling her. Mrs. Hatch went home, and Clara sat at the kitchen table alone for a while and thought about the injustice of it. That a woman could work her own land, learn her own trade, stand her own ground, and still have her character questioned simply because she had accepted help from a man. She thought about how the Dunbars understood that this was the kind of pressure that could work where direct intimidation had failed. She thought about the fact that this specific form of cruelty had been used against women for as long as there had been women trying to do something on their own. She was furious. She let herself be furious for about 20 minutes, sitting at that kitchen table, and then she went to find John. He was in the barn, and when she told him what she had heard, he went very still in the way that meant he was processing something carefully, and then he looked at her and said, "I'm sorry. This is my fault. I should have considered how it looked." "It doesn't look like anything," Clara said sharply, "because we've done nothing wrong. I know that, but the perception is being manufactured by men who want my land and are using my reputation as a weapon because they've run out of other weapons." She folded her arms. "I'm not going to be driven off my own property by gossip." "No," he agreed, "but we need to think about what to do." They did think about it, seriously and practically, over the course of that evening. The options as they saw them were as follows. Clara could ask Mrs. Hatch to serve as a kind of informal chaperone, spending more time at the property to satisfy the town's standards of propriety. John could take on a more formal arrangement, perhaps having another hired hand at the property to change the character of the living situation. Or they could simply present the town with a different kind of fact altogether. It was John who came closest to the third option without quite stating it directly, and Clara who brought it into the open. "You could court me properly," she said, with a directness that made him blink. If that is something you'd want, it would settle the question entirely, and it would give the Dunbars nothing to work with." John Prescott looked at her across the kitchen table with the oil lamp between them, and he was quiet for a very long time, and Clara's heart was conducting itself in a manner she found professionally embarrassing. "Clara," he said at last, "I want to be very clear about something. I would not court you to satisfy Caldwell's opinion of your character. I would court you because I want to, because I have wanted to for some weeks now and have been trying to find the right moment and the right words." He paused. "If you're asking me whether I'd like to court you, the answer is yes. If you're suggesting we do it primarily for strategic reasons, I'd rather face down the Dunbars a different way." She looked at him and felt the warm, inevitable rightness of it, the way the very best things feel, not like a surprise but like something recognized. "I'm not suggesting it for strategic reasons," she said. "I'm suggesting it because I would like you to court me. The strategy is incidental." He smiled then, fully, in a way she had not seen before, with his whole face, and it was such a remarkable thing that Clara spent a moment just looking at it. "All right then," he said. And so John Prescott began courting Clara Sawyer in the summer of 1878, in the proper fashion of the time, with visible, acknowledged attention, with Sunday walks in the early evening after the day's work was done, with occasional suppers in town at the hotel, where Mrs. Hatch presided with vigorous approval, with small gestures that were both practical and tender. He brought her wildflowers from the creek bank not as grand declarations, but as natural extensions of noticing what she liked. He sought her opinion on decisions about the property with a genuine interest in her thoughts that was, she was aware, a rarer quality than it should have been. He made time, in the midst of days that were genuinely full of hard work, to simply be present with her, to sit on the porch and read, to walk the fence line in the evenings when the work was done, and the light was extraordinary. The town adjusted its opinion with relative speed, as towns do when presented with a clear and uncomplicated narrative. Mrs. Hatch, who had significant social influence, made it broadly known that the arrangement between Miss Sawyer and Mr. Prescott was entirely proper, and that anyone suggesting otherwise was doing the Dunbar brothers' work for them. The suggestion that anyone might be doing the Dunbar brothers' work was sufficient to close most mouths in Caldwell. The Dunbars, deprived of their most effective tool, made one more attempt in August, a legal claim, filed at the county seat, that challenged Clara's right to the deed on the basis that Thomas Sawyer's estate had not been fully settled at the time of the deed's transfer. The claim was technically thin and amounted to little, but it required Clara to engage a lawyer, a young man from Wichita named Morrison, who came down on the train and reviewed the documents with competence and some drama, and declared the Dunbar claim baseless, which the county judge concurred with in a ruling that October. By the time the ruling came down, there were early frosts in the mornings, and the cottonwoods along the creek had gone gold, and the cattle were fat from the summer grass. And Clara Sawyer knew the land she was walking on in a way she had not known any ground in her life. Knew it the way you know something you have worked for with your hands and your time and your stubborn intention. She also knew John Prescott considerably better by then, which was a different but related education. She knew that he dreamed sometimes and woke in the early hours and lay still afterward, and she knew this because the house was small and the walls were not thick. She knew that he had a brother in Tennessee he had not spoken to in several years, a rupture he did not discuss in detail, but that sat somewhere in him as a quiet regret. She knew that he had a scar on his left forearm from a barbed wire incident some years ago that he described with such minimal detail that she eventually stopped asking about it. She knew that he was a man who felt things deeply and expressed very little of it, and that when he did express something, it was worth the wait. She knew that she was in love with him. She knew it the way you know a fact you have suspected for a long time and simply waited to confirm, not with shock but with the satisfied recognition of something proven. She told him on an October evening on the porch, with the gold cottonwoods glowing in the last light and the air carrying the sharp sweetness of autumn and wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney somewhere to the east. She told him simply and without preface, as was her general approach to important things. "I love you," she said. "I thought you should know." John had been looking at the cottonwoods. He turned and looked at her with those gray eyes that she had spent months learning to read, and what was in them was something so complete and open that it was almost overwhelming. Not just love, though it was certainly that, but the look of a man who has finally arrived somewhere he had given up hope of reaching. "Clara," he said, and stopped. He was not a man who struggled for words often, but he struggled then, and she found it endearing rather than frustrating, because she understood that what he was contending with was too large for easy language. He took her hand, carefully, the way he had in that field in June, but entirely differently, because now they both knew what it meant. He held it in both of his, looking at it as though it were something extraordinary, and then he looked up at her. "I have loved you," he said, "since approximately the third evening on this porch when you argued with me about the geological formation of the prairie for 45 minutes and were entirely right and refused to let me get away with being vague about things I should have known precisely." She laughed, a real, full laugh that surprised her, and he smiled with it, and it was possibly the best moment either of them had experienced in some time. "I love you," he said, more quietly. "I believe I have been working toward you since before I knew you existed." She thought of what he had said weeks ago about waiting for someone specific, and she understood it fully now, the faith required in that kind of waiting, and she thought that the world was sometimes, against all reasonable expectation, exactly as it should be. He asked Thomas Sawyer's neighbor, a man named Garrett who had known Clara now for several months, and had decided in his straightforward way that she was an excellent addition to the county, for his blessing to propose. He had no family in Kansas to consult, and Clara had no living family left at all, so this was a practical adaptation of the custom rather than a departure from it. Garrett gave his blessing warmly, and also offered the use of his wife's wedding ring as a temporary loan if needed, which John thanked him for and declined politely. He had, it turned out, a ring already. It had been his mother's, a small gold band with a garnet set in a simple silver mounting, and he had carried it for years in his saddlebag without any consciousness of it as a plan, the way you carry certain things simply because they belong to you and feel wrong to leave behind. He proposed on a November morning when the first real snow had come overnight, and the world was clean and white, and the creek was still and silver at the bottom of the rise, and Clara was standing on the porch with a cup of coffee watching the light come up over the snow-covered land. She heard him come up behind her and turned, and he was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hand and the ring, and she had perhaps 2 seconds of disbelief before the reality of what she was looking at settled fully over her. "Clara Sawyer," he said, "I would very much like to marry you if you'll have me. This land needs 2 people, and so, I think, do I." She looked at him standing in the morning light with the snow behind him and the simple, absolute honesty in his face, and she said yes before he had finished the sentence, and then she said it again more clearly when he seemed to need to hear it twice, and then he crossed the porch and she walked to meet him and he took her hands and she felt the ring slide onto her finger, and she thought that she had spent 24 years arriving here, to this exact porch, this exact morning, this exact man. They were married in December of 1878 in the small church in Caldwell, in the kind of ceremony that was modest in scale and large in meaning. Mrs. Hatch organized the women of the town to provide the wedding supper. Garrett and his wife stood as witnesses. Sheriff Corby attended in his Sunday clothes and gave a brief toast that was both sincere and efficient. The church was decorated with pine boughs and dried wildflowers, and the morning was cold and clear, and Clara wore her best dress, the deep green calico, now mended at one seam and newly pressed, and she looked, as Mrs. Hatch said with some emotion afterward, like exactly the right woman in exactly the right place. John wore his good coat and a new shirt Clara had made him, and he was not a man who was easy with formal occasions. But he stood at the front of the church and watched Clara walk down the aisle on Garrett's arm, and his face was so undisguisedly full of what he felt for her that at least 2 women in the pews found themselves reaching for handkerchiefs. The minister, a gentle and scholarly man named Reverend Cole, read the ceremony with appropriate gravity, and when he reached the part about the wife's role and the husband's role and the mutual obligations of marriage, Clara listened to every word and understood them as a contract between equals rather than a transfer of property, which was how she intended to hold it. She thought John understood it the same way. She was not wrong. They said their vows in clear, steady voices, and when Reverend Cole told John he could kiss his bride, John Prescott kissed Clara Sawyer with a careful, warm tenderness that was brief in duration and somehow enormous in weight, the first of a great many kisses that would follow, and the congregation applauded with genuine warmth, and Mrs. Hatch cried without any self-consciousness whatsoever. The winter was a real one, hard, with heavy snow in January and a stretch of bitter cold in February that tested the cattle and required constant vigilance and close management. Clara and John worked through it side by side, and the intimacy of the first real winter together, sharing the work, sharing the cold, sharing the small house with its quilts and wood stove, and the quiet understanding that had by now grown into something so deep and particular to them, that it had almost its own language, deepened everything between them, in ways that Clara had not fully anticipated but embraced completely. They were good together in the specific, practical way that matters most in a life, that consists primarily of real things rather than ideals. They thought differently. John approached problems with a methodical patience, and Clara with a quick synthesis that sometimes got ahead of the evidence. And they each supplied what the other lacked, and they knew it, and they were both genuinely grateful for it. They were also simply good together in the way that has nothing to do with complementarity, and everything to do with the inexplicable alignment that occurs between 2 particular people and no others. The way she could make him laugh when nothing was funny, The way his presence in a room made something settle in her that was otherwise always slightly restless. The way they could sit in silence for an hour and both feel it had been a conversation. Spring came again to the Kansas plains, and Clara's kitchen garden was ambitious. Thomas's old beds plus 3 new ones, she had dug herself over the winter whenever the ground permitted, and the cattle operation was more stable than it had been since before Thomas's health had declined. John had renegotiated the grazing arrangement with a neighboring rancher that brought in additional income, and Clara had begun selling eggs and butter to the hotel in Caldwell, a small additional income that was hers specifically, and that she kept separate with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has always understood the importance of financial clarity. She told John about the baby in April of 1879, on a morning when the wildflowers were coming up along the creek bank, and she had spent several days being certain before she said anything. He was at the table with his coffee when she told him, and he set the coffee down very carefully, and she watched his face do something she had not seen it do before. A sequence of things, actually, astonishment, and then understanding, and then something so wide open and full that she could not name it precisely except to say that it was the happiest she had ever seen a person look. He stood up and came to her and held her face in both his hands and looked at her as though she were something extraordinary, which, to be clear, she was, and said, "Clara," and stopped, and she understood that he meant everything. Their son was born in November of 1879, and they named him Thomas James Prescott, Thomas for the uncle who had given them the land and James for John's father who had died when John was young. He was, from the first, a serious and watchful infant who studied the world with gray eyes that were unmistakably his father's, and he grew rapidly into a sturdy toddler who liked to be carried to the barn to see the horses and who reached for everything with the determined grip of someone, convinced that the world was full of interesting things he had not examined yet. John Prescott was, as a father, exactly what Clara would have predicted, and entirely more moving in practice than in anticipation, patient, present, specific in his attention, with a gentleness toward the boy that was the same gentleness he brought to everything he cared about, unhurried and real. He talked to Thomas from the beginning, explaining things in full, reasonable detail, the same way he had always talked to the horses and the cattle, and to Clara herself, as though the listener was capable of more than you might assume and deserved to be treated accordingly. The years that followed were not without difficulty. 1880 brought a drought that cut the grass short and required hard decisions about the herd, and 1881 brought a legal dispute with a new neighbor over a water access right that occupied most of their autumn and required another trip to the county seat before it was resolved in their favor. There were years when the cattle market was poor and years when the weather was punishing, and always the sheer cumulative weight of the work, which never diminished and which in the long years of a life required a particular kind of endurance that Clara and John both had in abundance. But there were also years of such specific and unremarkable happiness that, looking back on them later, they both found them difficult to describe, because the vocabulary of happiness is imprecise compared to the vocabulary of suffering. There were the mornings, so many of them, when the sun came up over the Kansas plains, and the light moved through the grass in a way that was purely beautiful, and the smell of coffee came from inside the house, and the cattle were calm in the lower pasture, and the cottonwoods along the creek were gold or green or silver or bare depending on the season, and all of it was theirs. The Dunbars sold their operation in 1882 and left the county under circumstances that involved some complicated business dealings that Clara never fully disentangled, but that resulted in their departure, which Caldwell received with moderate satisfaction. Wade Dunbar's specific variety of land acquisition through intimidation had not been universally popular, and his leaving did not occasion mourning in most quarters. Clara went to Mrs. Hatch the week after the Dunbars' departure and had tea, and they spoke about it with the measured satisfaction of women who have outlasted something they were told they couldn't. John's brother in Tennessee sent a letter in the autumn of 1881, the first communication in several years, tentative and awkward and full of things left unsaid in the way that letters between estranged brothers often are. John read it on the porch in the evening and was quiet for a long time afterward. Clara sat beside him and did not ask until he was ready to speak. He wrote back eventually several drafts, which was unusual for a man who was generally economical with words, reflecting the difficulty of navigating something that had been broken for a long time. The correspondence between them was slow and halting over the following year, but it continued, and by the end of 1882 there was something like a bridge being rebuilt, if not yet fully walkable. Clara encouraged it quietly, because she understood the particular weight of unresolved family, having her own complicated history with silence and distance, and she thought the world generally contained enough irreparable things without adding another where repair was possible. Thomas grew from an infant to a toddler to a child who could name every horse in the county by the time he was 4, and who had opinions about the kitchen garden that he expressed with the direct confidence of someone who had spent his whole life in a household where opinions were given and received as a matter of course. The second baby was a girl, born in the summer of 1883, and they named her Ruth. She arrived in July when the heat was pressing and relentless, and the prairie was the particular scorched gold of a Kansas summer, and she came into the world with a loud, declarative cry that suggested she had a clear sense of the relative importance of things and intended to make it known. She had Clara's dark hair and Clara's capacity for emotional directness, and within weeks she had distinguished herself from her brother by making it unmistakable when she was unhappy about something, which John observed with a gentle amusement that suggested he found this quality entirely appropriate. John Prescott and Clara Sawyer in these years, John and Clara Prescott by now, though she had kept the Sawyer name attached to the land's working title out of respect for Thomas, were not the same people who had sat across from each other in a saloon in 1878, a quiet man reading his newspaper and a dusty woman who had just lost her only local connection in one afternoon. They were different people, shaped by years and work, and the specific ongoing education of loving someone closely over time. They had learned each other's limits, the points at which his patience ran out, the points at which her pragmatism shaded into cold management, and she needed reminding that feelings were also facts. They had argued, sometimes with real heat, over the kinds of decisions that life on a working ranch required. How to handle the lean years, how much risk to take on, how to balance what they owed to the land against what they owed to the children. They had argued and resolved and reached, over time, the kind of understanding that is not agreement on everything, but the knowledge that the other person's position is worthy of respect and will be genuinely considered. They had found, most importantly, that the love between them had not faded with familiarity in the way that certain romantic philosophies suggested it would, but had instead become more complex and more durable, the way good wood does not become brittle with age but more dense, harder to damage, capable of bearing more weight. In the evenings, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet and the Kansas dark was enormous and star-brilliant outside, they still sat on the porch sometimes and read side by side, or talked, or simply sat in the silence that had always been one of the better languages between them. Clara would look at the man beside her, older now, a little more weathered, the gray at his temples something she had first noticed a year ago, and she would think about the evening in the Red Lantern Saloon when she had walked up to a stranger's table and asked if he was John Prescott, and she would feel something that was both gratitude and wonder at the strange logic of things, at how a deed to a piece of land she had never seen and a man she had never met had become the whole shape of her life, and she would not change a single particular of it. She told him this once, in the autumn of 1884, sitting on that same porch that John had repaired in his first days of knowing her, looking at the same cottonwoods along the same creek, 6 years after she had arrived on the afternoon stage with her trunk and her satchel and her spine of solid material, and her complete ignorance of cattle. He listened to her say it, and when she was done he put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the evening settled around them, the fireflies, the meadowlark's last song, the enormous Kansas dark beginning at the edges, and he said, "I know, it's the same for me. I think about it sometimes," she said, "that I could have sold the land. I thought about it that first week. I thought, this is too much, too far from anything I know." "What changed your mind?" he asked. She smiled against his shoulder. "The porch," she said. "The way the morning light came off the creek, and then you." She felt him breathe. "The order is important," she added. "First the porch." He laughed, and it was the low, real laugh she had loved since almost the beginning, and she felt the vibration of it through her whole body. "I'll take second place to the porch," he said, happily. They sat together as the stars came out in their multitudes over the flat Kansas land, the kind of sky that reminds you there are more things than you can count, and that being one small particular thing in the enormous world is not a diminishment, but a specific, irreplaceable kind of grace. Thomas was 5 by then, serious and bright, and obsessed with the creek and its inhabitants, the frogs and the small fish, and the way the water moved over the rocks. And Ruth, at 1 year old, was already pulling herself upright and looking at the world with those dark, determined eyes, and the expression of someone who intended to get to every interesting thing as quickly as possible. John taught Thomas to ride in the spring of 1885, an event of such moment in the boy's estimation that he spoke of almost nothing else for weeks beforehand, and was so tightly wound with excitement the morning of the first lesson that Clara had to redirect him several times from the table before he had eaten anything useful. She stood at the fence and watched John lead Thomas around the paddock on the gentle bay pepper, who was old now but reliable as ever, and she watched her husband's face as he talked the boy through it, calm, patient, precise. And she thought that there were kinds of love she had not known she was capable of until she had a child, and kinds of love she had not known were possible until she had this specific man. And together they made something she could not have imagined in Missouri when she was a young woman teaching her father's Sunday school class and thinking that her life was somewhere in front of her. Her life was here. It was exactly here. In the summer of 1885, John's brother William came from Tennessee on the train, the first visit between them in 12 years, a trip that was the result of 2 years of careful correspondence and Clara's quiet persistence, and John's eventual willingness to believe that what was broken could be mended. William Prescott was a shorter, more talkative version of his brother, with lighter hair and an expressive quality that John notably lacked, and he and Clara got along immediately in the way that sometimes happens when a person meets the family of someone they love and understands something new about that person from it. William stayed for 2 weeks, sleeping in the room they had added to the house the previous year, and he and John spent long evenings on the porch talking through the years of silence with a careful, imperfect honesty that was the best that men of that time and place could generally manage, which was not always enough but was better than nothing. When William left on the train back east, the two brothers embraced briefly on the platform in Caldwell in the way of men who were not accustomed to such demonstrations, and John watched the train go with a look that Clara recognized as the specific expression he wore when something sat heavily in him, not grief exactly, but the weight of time and all it contained. She took his hand on the platform and held it, and he squeezed once tightly, and they walked back to the wagon together. Ruth learned to walk in the fall of 1884, and by 1885 was running with the determined, slightly dangerous confidence of a child who is faster than her judgment, and the house was accordingly livelier than it had been in the preceding year. She followed Thomas everywhere, which Thomas bore with varying degrees of patience depending on whether she was touching his things, and the dynamic between them was one of constant low-level negotiation punctuated by moments of genuine loyalty, which Clara observed with the recognition of something she understood to be fundamental. The property had grown in these years, not dramatically, because Clara and John were not reckless people, but steadily, with the addition of a parcel to the east that had come available when an older rancher retired and moved to live with his daughter in Topeka. They had made the purchase carefully, borrowing against a modest savings they had built over several good cattle years, and John had spent the following season developing the new pasture with the same methodical care he brought to everything. And by the end of it, the herd had grown to just over 100 head, and the operation was genuinely viable in a way it had not fully been when Clara had first arrived. She sat with the accounts on winter evenings at the kitchen table, as she had done since the beginning, and she found in the numbers a satisfaction she had always found in order, the clear record of what had been done and what it had cost and what it had yielded. She was good at it, had always been good at numbers, and John trusted her judgment entirely on financial matters, which was a trust she returned in full on matters of the herd and the land. They had built something between them that neither of them could have built alone, which was, she sometimes thought, exactly the right definition of a marriage. By the end of 1885, the Prescott Ranch, it was called that now, in county records and in common usage, the Sawyer name preserved in Clara's heart and in the kitchen garden she still tended with a personal ferocity, was a known and established concern. John had a reputation in the county that had grown alongside the operation, a man who kept his word, who maintained his fences and his agreements, who was willing to help a neighbor in a difficult season and not keep account of it. Clara had her own reputation, harder won by the nature of things but solid, as a woman of intelligence and practical capability who ran the administrative side of the operation and who was not to be underestimated in any negotiation. Together, they were the kind of couple that the community found reassuring, not flashy or loud, but durable, the sort that would still be there in 20 years, which turned out to be accurate. They found out about the third baby in the spring of 1886, and this time Clara told John in the morning before the day's work began, sitting at the kitchen table with their coffee while Thomas was still asleep, and Ruth was making her purposeful way around the kitchen looking for something she was not supposed to have. John looked up from his coffee and absorbed the news with the same quality of attention he brought to everything important, and then he smiled slowly, and it was the same smile she had first seen across a saloon table in 1878, the one that changed his whole face. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Fine," she said. "Good." She paused. "Tired. We'll manage the work differently." "We'll manage it the same. I managed 2 children and a drought in the same season. A baby is not going to stop the fence line from needing riding." He looked at her with that quiet, persistent admiration she had by now accepted as one of the permanent features of her life. "No," he said, "I suppose it won't." The third child, another son, was born in November of 1886, and they named him Daniel, for no particular legacy reason, but simply because both of them liked the sound of it and agreed it suited him before they had even properly looked at him. Daniel arrived with Thomas's gray eyes and Ruth's disposition, watchful and loud in sequence, a combination that kept both his older siblings interested in him from the beginning, which was probably the ideal outcome. John was 38 by then, and Clara was 32, and they had been on the land together for 8 years, and the woman who had stepped off the afternoon stage in Caldwell, Kansas. In the spring of 1878, with a deed and a dead uncle, and the particular courage of someone who has nothing left to lose, was not the same woman who stood in the November kitchen holding her third child and looking out the window at the frost on the kitchen garden, and the smoke rising from the barn chimney and the cottonwoods bare and silver along the creek. She was better. Not in the way that suggests the previous version was deficient, but in the way that a thing becomes itself more fully with time, more sure of its nature, more precise about what it wants and what it is, more capable of the particular happiness that comes from knowing where you belong and having built something real there. She heard John come in from the barn and stamp the cold off his boots on the porch and push open the kitchen door, and she turned with the baby on her hip, and he came across the kitchen and kissed her first and then took the baby, and the three of them stood in the warm kitchen for a moment with the cold coming in from outside in a rush, and then the door closing it out again. And it was, Clara thought, the exact ordinary substance of a life that matters. And she was grateful for every particular piece of it. Outside, Thomas was calling something across the yard to whoever would listen, and Ruth's voice came back with the particular pitch that meant she was both responding and disputing something simultaneously. And John looked over his shoulder at the door and then at Clara with that half-smile that meant he found their children genuinely amusing even when they were exhausting. "I believe those two are negotiating again," he said. "They are always negotiating," Clara said. "Thomas wants what he wants and Ruth wants what Thomas wants, and it never ends." "They'll sort it out," he said. "They always do," she agreed. She put her hand on John's arm, on the rough wool of his jacket, and leaned against him briefly as he held Daniel, who was beginning to doze with the satisfied weight of an infant who has eaten and been held, and is therefore at peace with the world. The kitchen was warm and smelled of the stew Clara had started before noon, and outside the wind moved across the prairie the way it always did and always would, steady and enormous and indifferent to everything except the fact of its own motion. But inside this house on this rise above this creek, there was nothing indifferent. Every piece of it had been chosen and built and tended and kept by these two people with their specific histories and their specific courage and their love that had been, from the beginning, the kind that knows its own nature. Clara Sawyer had come to Caldwell, Kansas, with a deed and no plan, and John Prescott had been waiting on someone specific, and what followed had been the whole length and width and depth of a life. The hard seasons and the good ones, the children and the land, the quiet evenings and the fierce mornings, the arguments and the silences, and the inexhaustible inventory of small moments that are the actual material of which a life is made. The years continued to add themselves, one after another, in the way that years do when a person is paying attention to something more important than counting them. Daniel grew from a round, serious baby into a quick-minded boy who loved mathematics and could already, at 4, outpace his father in certain arithmetic calculations, which John acknowledged with a combination of pride and resigned amusement. Ruth at 6 was everything Clara had predicted she would be: forthright, passionate, already reading at a level that required the local schoolteacher, a young woman named Miss Palmer, to find her additional materials. Thomas at 7 was beginning to be genuinely useful on the ranch in ways that were not just educational but practical, and he brought to everything the same focused patience he had inherited from his father, the kind that gets difficult things done without drama. Clara started the first women's reading circle in Caldwell in 1887, organizing it at the hotel on Tuesday evenings with Mrs. Hatch's enthusiastic support. It was an unremarkable thing in the context of history and an important thing in the context of these women's lives. A place where the women of the county, who worked as hard as anyone and had less forum for thought that wasn't practical, could gather around Thomas Sawyer's books and some others obtained from the Wichita Lending Library, and read and discuss and argue, which Clara had always believed was among the most important things a person could do. John supported this endeavor with the same quiet wholeness he brought to everything she cared about. He managed the children on Tuesday evenings without complaint, fed them supper, and got them to bed with a competent calm that 3 children had done nothing to diminish. And when Clara came home from the reading circle with her cheeks warm from the discussion and something lit in her eyes that he recognized as intellectual excitement, He had tea ready and was genuinely interested in what they had read. She loved him for it. She loved him for it specifically and without diminishment. The way you love someone for a thing that they do not think is remarkable, but that you know, from long experience of the world, is rarer than it should be. The reading circle grew to 14 women by 1888, and they had worked their way through a significant portion of Thomas Sawyer's library, and were beginning to make their own purchases from the bookshop in Wichita. And it was one of the best things Clara had built in Kansas, second perhaps only to the kitchen garden and the family and the operation that now kept them comfortably and securely, but a real thing, a thing that mattered to more than just herself. In the summer of 1888, she and John rode out to the highest point of their land, a low ridge on the north section that gave an uninterrupted view of the plains in every direction, east to the dark line of a distant tree row, west to where the sky came down and met the grass, north and south to the flat horizon. They had ridden up there in the early morning before the children were awake, leaving Thomas in charge with the specific gravity of a 7-year-old who has been trusted with something. And they sat on the ridge in the cool morning air with their horses grazing behind them and the world enormous and beautiful, and theirs in every direction. "Do you remember," Clara said, "what you said to me that first week, that it would be hard?" "I did say that, and I said I knew, and I asked if you really did," she smiled. "I didn't entirely, I thought I did, but I didn't know the specific kind of hard it would be." "Is it what you wanted?" he asked. "This life?" She looked at him, this man who had waited for someone specific and had been waiting for her, the kind of man who asked a genuine question and waited genuinely for the answer. "It is more than what I wanted," she said, "because what I wanted when I came here was survival and some independence. I wanted to not be lost." She looked out over the plains. "What I have is different from that. What I have is this." She gestured imprecisely at everything. "The land, the children, the work, you." He was quiet for a moment. "You." She turned, and he was looking at her the way he had looked at her on that first porch evening when they had talked about what he had been waiting for, but different now because they both knew the answer and had lived inside it for 10 years, and the knowledge made it not less but more certain, more full, more entirely itself. He reached for her hand and held it, and they sat on the high ground in the morning light and looked at the world they had made together. And Clara thought that this was what it meant to be loved specifically. Not approximately, not in a general way, not as a category of person, but as yourself, as Clara Sawyer who had stepped off an afternoon stage with dirt on her boots, and a spine made of solid material and a willingness to trust a quiet man in a corner table, and had discovered that the world sometimes exceeded its own reputation, if you were willing to stay in it and build something and love the right person with your whole capable heart. The prairie wind moved through the grass below the ridge, and the horses lifted their heads briefly and then went back to grazing, and somewhere to the east a meadowlark sang 3 notes and then 3 more, and the morning came in full and luminous over the Kansas plains. John Prescott held Clara Prescott's hand on the high ground above their land, and behind them, the house they had repaired and built onto and filled with 3 children and books, and the evidence of years of good work sat solid and particular on its rise above the creek. And before them, the entire western sky opened wide and blue and without limit, the way it always had and would, the way the best things in the world continue long after you have finished marveling at them. It was enough. It was, in every way that a life can be measured, more than enough. It was everything.